Today, our speaker, Sophie Campbell, absolutely remarkable. I think you may be familiar with some of her writing. She's been writing for many, many years, journalist, particular focus as a columnist in travel and heritage. It was the Daily Telegraph heritage column that she ran for many years also. She's here to speak to us about the absolutely extraordinary Fleet Street that we find ourselves located along, and quite why for so many centuries it's been a remarkable place. I'd like to hand over the floor just before we get started with Sophie, though, to our sponsor. This is Flora from the Fleet Street Quarter, who we have to thank for funding this wonderful monthly programme and lunch.
This is a very quick hello from me. As you know, you are at Dr. Johnson's house, but what you might not know is that you're also in the Fleet Street Quarter, as Salim said. We are a business improvement district, and that means that we're here to celebrate the area, work with local businesses, work with charities, local organisations, to celebrate everything that the Fleet Street Quarter and its environs can be. So there's a little bit more information on us here. We run a series of events. We have literary festivals, we have plays, we also have things to do with conservation and climate change. And if you were to be so kind to sign up to our newsletter, you'll be able to keep updated with all of that stuff. And this event today is actually part of our Discover Fleet Street Quarter series, which is a way of welcoming people to the area, and is our kind of start of term concept to celebrate everything that's here. I will stop rabbiting on. I will hand over to Sophie, and I hope you have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hi everybody. It's quite weird talking about a place that you just walked along. It's like one of those little paintings, you know, when there's a painting within a painting. I was originally going to call this talk a stroll along the street of shame, and that suddenly is beginning to look very anachronistic now, because the age of journalism on Fleet Street is really officially over. And before I start, actually, do we have any hacks? Do we have anyone who worked on Fleet Street here in journalism? One, excellent. Oh, maybe just one. So maybe at the end you might have some information that you can add in. But so I decided basically, this is rather a nice picture of Fleet Street during the war, which is interesting because look at how many publications there are on sale, and obviously paper was quite short during the war. This is fairly early on, but anyone who's a Fleet Street regular will recognise the old bell there in the corner. And I decided to call it Hold the Front Page, the changing place of Fleet Street, because things are really moving fast now from 2022 when the big changes started happening. And all the tours that I've done, so I'm a guide, I've been a guide for about 15 years, and all the tours that I've done have basically been around scaffolding. And so it's really, really nice that it's beginning to go, and suddenly these buildings are beginning to re-emerge, looking more beautiful than they have for quite a long time. Now I've got lots to talk about, so I hope this isn't too much of a gallop. If I'm going too fast, let me know. I hope you can all hear at the back. Is everything? Yeah. This is a really nice print of Fleet Street in the Regency period, the early 1800s. And you can see the clock of St Dunstan in the west very, very clearly there. And you've just got here, oh, sorry, I just hit the wrong button. And here, you may recognise Temple Bar. If you know St Paul's Cathedral, you know that Temple Bar is next to St Paul's now. And this was basically the passing point from the city of Westminster into the city of London. Now, technically, the city of London's border was the River Fleet, the physical border. But actually, you had this sort of almost quarter of a mile of sort of build-up, and you had Temple Bar, Holborn bars. There were bars all the way around the gates of the old city. What's interesting about this is you've got a booksellers here, but you have no newspapers. So at this stage, there weren't very many newspaper offices. You've got these very handsome buildings, and the Temple Bar was removed because of traffic, even back then. And so it was removed and went to the country for a while, and only came back to St Paul's about 15 or 20 years ago. Here's an anachronistic illustration of Fleet Street offices, but it's in the 1880s. And you'll notice they've got these jettied fronts. And although there are several buildings that look like this on Fleet Street now, so very, very narrow in proportion to the height. And that's because originally they would have been on the footprint of a medieval street. And so when they expanded, they couldn't go sideways, so they went up, and then you needed more room, so you jettied out. And really the only building we've still got on Fleet Street that's got that is outside Middle Temple. It's King Henry's Rooms. This is a couple of years ago, sort of the view obviously east to St Paul's up Ludgate Hill. Lots of buses and office workers, so basically not a newspaper again to be seen, but you can just see, sorry, I keep hitting that thing, you can just see the Reuters building here, which it shared with Associated Press until about 2015. I just thought I'd put it into a bit of context. So this is the Great Bend that goes from the City of London on the right, 2,000 years old, just about, and the river is basically flowing this way from the City of Westminster, which is coming up to about 1,000 years old. And two major churches. So what I've got here is St Paul's, and here is Westminster Abbey. And the old St Paul's was built actually at about around the same time as Westminster Abbey, today's Westminster Abbey, the original version. They were both built in the late 1000s. And so what you got was two centres of power from the moment that Edward the Confessor decided not to move into the City of London, but to build himself a settlement that was royal and religious rather than mercantile and commercial. You immediately had two centres of power in London. And basically, in between those centres of power, you got the lawyers down the Strand and Fleet Street, so perfectly placed to deal with in both directions. And just to, this is a close-up, and if you look here, we're very near here, so you've got Inner Temple here, you can just see Middle Temple here, Lincoln's Inn Fields very obviously up here, and Gray's Inn is just off the map. Now those are the four Inns of Court, and to this day every barrister who is working in England and Wales must be affiliated to one of those Inns of Court, wherever you're working. Now around here was an absolute jumble of civil courts, which in the late 1800s would all be rolled into one enormous building in the Royal Courts of Justice, but that wouldn't happen. This is John Roxmack from 1746, and this wouldn't happen for another almost 200 years after that. But what there was just here is the River Fleet. You can see coming all the way down. So it starts in Hampstead, goes through the swimming ponds if anyone swims on the heath, and arrives at the River Thames. And the reason that we barely know about it now is that it's completely covered and has been since the late 18th century. They started covering it in the late 18th century, and it was completed in time for Queen Victoria to open Holborn Viaduct and Blackfriars Bridge on the same day. What is just here is the Fleet Prison, which was literally on the banks of the River Thames. So a lot of the little streets that you see off the Farringdon Road were actually water. They were little quays. And then you've also got here, you can just see the road at Old Bailey, and this was on top of Newgate Prison, which didn't close until 1902. And so what you've got here is basically a centre of literate people. You've got two major churches with highly read clerics. You also have the law, and you've also got stories coming from the prisons. And so you're beginning to get the sort of soil that was going to create Fleet Street. Now, I'm sure many of you know this plaque. It always looks as if somebody's thrown custard at it. But it's at the, if anyone knows the Leon on Ludgate Circus, it's just on the wall there, and it's had a very annoying cable hanging across it for ages. And so I risked my life to get this picture with photography lifted up the cable. Anyway, as you can see, it's the first daily newspaper in London, and was called the Daily Courant. And courant meaning running in French or current, and so that's really current affairs. And it was a very simple paper, as you can see. It's not a great image, but it was a single sheet. It only had news on the front, and on the back it had some limited advertising. And it was basically started where that, the reason I had that yellow arrow, I forgot to say, is where it started. And basically it was printed on paper pulp, handmade paper, on a very simple press that in those days probably might still have been a screw press and was possibly one with a handle like this. And so very limited amount of papers that you could do. This is a fantastic picture of the Fleet River and the Fleet Bridge, which is why Fleet Street has its name, because the bridge connected Ludgate Circus with what we now know is Fleet Street, and the river went underneath. Now, this was done by a Londoner called Samuel Scott, and he did a lot of topographical and marine work, and his style notably changed once Canaletto was in town. And Canaletto was doing these incredibly elegant, and London always looks like a sort of Venice. And this is exactly the same. Because look at this, this was a well-known bridge, and the reason it's so high is because of all of these boats that could drop their sails and go up the river. And there was a really serious amount of trade on the river fleet. It was a very, very busy river. And one of the things that would have been coming up and down that river were rags. And rags was what you needed to make paper pulp. And they also would have had a supply of water, fresh water going right past from Hampstead, which was famously pure at the time. And so you can see why this was a good place for the Daily Courant to have started in a pub, probably called the White Hart, roughly where Leon's is now. And they were on the upper floor of that. And you can see St Bride's with its very distinctive spire, and at the other side you can see St Martin within Ludgate, on Ludgate Hill. The reason this is slightly anachronistic as well is that Scott, he was very careful. His full title is the mouth of the Fleet River around 1725, and that probably might have vaguely looked like that back then. But by the time he was doing it, this print came out in the 1740s, 50s. Already the Fleet River was being referred to as the Fleet Ditch, and it's referred to as that in Alexander Pope's poem, the Dunciad. So it was filthy and full of dead dogs and rubbish and sewage, and so eventually it was covered over, as I said earlier. Now, into this mix, and going back in time somewhat, you get Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz in Germany had basically come up with one of those enormous technological leaps that went from a piece of wood that you carved your page into in your illustration, whatever, and then you printed it on a press, one sheet at a time, and that was it. Once that piece of wood was worn out, that was it. That was the end of the print edition. What Gutenberg did was come up with the idea of movable metal type. So the metal being, and of course the Chinese had done this about 450 years earlier, but they were using ceramics, which probably wouldn't have lasted as long. So you basically have something that there was a lot of metal workers around London. They knew how to make dies, for jewellery, etc. And so it wasn't a big jump. But when he basically started, he was a mercer. Caxton, who brought this to England. William Caxton was a mercer, who basically mercers were the people who controlled the trade in luxury fabrics, the import and export of luxury fabrics, very wealthy generally and often well-travelled. Caxton went over to the Low Countries for business reasons and realised that there was this new thing that could make a really good business. And he originally started printing over there because there was still very strong control of the printed word in England. And then he moved back, and this picture in the middle is a rather fanciful image of where he was in Westminster. He was definitely printing somewhere in the precincts of the city of the Westminster Abbey. And if you're in the Abbey, there's a plaque to him near where you can go up the new tower. And then on the right, you've got the wonderfully named Wynkyn de Voorde, obviously known here as Wynkyn de Worde. But it seems too good to be true that he was a printer, and his surname was Word. It seems that he in fact was born in an area of the Low Countries called Wood. And anyway, he was Caxton's journeyman, and obviously rose to be quite important to him, because when Caxton died, he left Wynkyn de Voorde all his printing presses, his materials, and his business. And there seems to have been some sort of a court case. I haven't quite got to the bottom of how involved it was. I suspect it was the family resenting the fact that it had gone to a non-family member. I don't know. But anyway, he decided to move from Westminster, and where he moved to, this is a sort of thing that you needed when you were doing hot metal. And there are so many terms that come from printing in our language today. And perhaps the most obvious one in modern offices is upper and lower case, because the capital letters were in the top of a compositor's case, and the lower case were obviously the smaller letters were in the lower part. And phrases like minding your P's and Q's, because these cases were organised not in alphabetical order and not in what we would call QWERTY, but they were organised in for how much you use them. So they differed according to your language, obviously. And in English, P's and Q's we used almost the same, and especially if you were an apprentice printer, it was very easy to mark them up. So this is the sort of thing that evolved out of CACs and printing and would have been recognisable to people right up to the 1980s, basically. Vicar de Wood moved to somewhere very near here, probably just on the corner of the new Salisbury Square development, at the junction of Shoe Lane and Fleet Street, somewhere around there. We're not entirely sure where, but there's a black plaque to him in St Bride's Church. And I've put Stationers' Hall here, which was very badly bombed in the war and had to be rebuilt. They did a pretty good job. And Stationers' Hall had been there since the early 1400s, so before hot metal even existed. And he set himself up there because, as I mentioned before, you had all this learning. And here's a picture of St Paul's, what would have been St Paul's churchyard, the precincts of St Paul's, which is now on the right. You've got Paternoster Square, rebuilt in the 1980s and 1990s, very controversially. And on the left, you've got rather a nice, this is from Magpie Alley, which is just over the road here, and has a wonderful display of printing on tiles. And this is one of the colophons used by Vicar de Wood. Anyway, the place on the right, now Paternoster Square, when it was part of St Paul's churchyard, the clergy would have walked around the cathedral saying their rosary, which is why Paternoster comes from Our Father. So you said an Our Father, and then you said 10 Hail Marys, and then you said Amen. And that's why we've got Paternoster Square, Ave Maria Street, and Amen Corner. And what St Paul's Churchyard was very famous for was already known as a printing centre and a centre of publishing. But of course, it was manuscripts. It was publishing, not printing. It was basically they were using manuscripts before this period, and so there were lots of stands around St Paul's Churchyard. And I don't know if anyone's been to India recently, but certainly when I first went to India, you had scribes at the railway stations who were there to write letters for people who couldn't write. And I think it must have been fairly similar to that, because you not only had them selling the materials, animal skins, the parchment. The most expensive of which was vellum, ink made from oak gall, and also quills, etc. But you also had people selling their services. So people who were writers, scribes, and limners who were the illuminators. And so there was a long tradition of this, and then that evolved into the print world, and hence the name. These little stands were called stations, and that's where stationers comes from. Here's just an idea again from Magpie Alley, and this is really showing the world of Fleet Street as it was in Vicar de Wood's time, so around about 1500. And interestingly, the only pub is here, the Horn Tavern, which later became the Cheshire Cheese. So, and you've got here the Pinson, who was one of the royal printers, and down here you've got Bertolet. Where's his office? I can't quite see it, but Bertolet is also down here, and those were two royal printers. So we're printing Bibles and things, which is a very dangerous thing to be doing in the 1500s, especially when Henry VIII was around. So I'm going fast because I haven't got very much time, but I'm missing poor Dr. Johnson, who has to have because I had put a piece in on hacks, and the word hack comes from the hackney carriage, the early version of the cab, and a bit like barristers, cab rank rule, if you needed the money, you took the job. And so Dr. Johnson was such a good example of that, simply because he struggled so hard until the dictionary, made him. And I think he's sort of should be the patron saint of hack. But anyway, during this time as well, you had the big difference in the dissemination of information and basically the beginnings of the industrialisation of the printing process. Just in terms of subject matter in Fleet Street, this is a lovely picture of somebody trapped in the Fleet prison. Now, he would have been a debtor, and they think that right up until really probably credit cards were invented, a bit before that, but 19th century, they think that a huge percentage of the prison population, probably in Dickens's time, as much as 60% of the population was in debt. And so you weren't kept from a punitive point of view, they weren't trying to punish you, they were trying to keep you there till you paid the debt. And so quite often you were allowed out during the day, your family, and this is very visible in Dickens, your family was able to visit you, possibly live with you. And this is somebody in the Fleet Prison. Now the Fleet Prison particularly famous for the Fleet Parsons, who were not paid very much, and they quite often went into debt and ended up for a period of time in the Fleet Prison until they could get themselves out. Now they were very happy to marry the children of people without children who hadn't got permission from their parents to get married. And that was a big problem if you were an heir or an heiress, because if you married the wrong person, your parents were going to be very upset about it. And so the Fleet Parsons made quite a lot of money from this until Lord Hardwicke, who had a vested interest, passed the Marriage Act in the late 1800s, and basically that began the race to Gretna Green. And as you can imagine, that was the most fantastic copy, because you had not only did you have the old stories of the young people who shouldn't have got married getting married with the Fleet Parsons, you then got the brothers and fathers chasing them to Gretna Green with reports in the papers, so it's quite well covered. So that was one good source. You also, this is Middle Temple, and obviously the lawyers had access to fantastic stories about, particularly the criminal lawyers, would have had very good stories, knew what was going on. And this was disseminated in two particularly brilliant ways. And one is on the right, you've got a map of the number of coffee houses that were in London from the first one, which was started in the 1650s, just on the other, further back in London. And this is not round here, but it gives you an idea of how many coffee houses there were. It was an explosion. And if you imagine that in the 1500s, we were generally drinking small beer, small ale, and even children would have been drinking that too. And Dr. Matthew Green, I don't know if he's spoken to you, but he's quite fascinating on these subjects, and he has a theory that basically the national hangover cleared when coffee arrived. And then suddenly, we began to speed towards this great empire that we would have, and of course that was reflected in the papers. Anyway, it's a great idea. And the St Martin within Ludgate was right next to the London coffee houses, which was much patronised by the Fleet Parsons and the lawyers and the proto-journalists. So all these information sources came together, and then even better is when you added alcohol. So the pubs, and obviously this is just near here, the Old Cock. Anyone who's worked on Fleet Street will remember which papers the journalists went to. So there were the pubs really did fuel a lot of information passing. I put this in because this is a print from 1900, but it's looking back to the great age of coaching. And the reason I put it in is that as we move from really the age of periodicals in the 1700s, which is what Dr. Johnson would have been writing, we begin to move towards the invention of the newspaper. We had toll roads and turnpikes for the first time, so suddenly you could get around the country much, much more easily. The printing technology had improved, so you could print more sheets of paper. And what would happen is in the early days of the coaching routes, you didn't have postmasters or postmistresses, they didn't exist at that time. But what you did have was usually somebody who lived in a town, in a city, who would take in all the post, so people would come and pay for it, you had to pay to get your post at that time. And they would then put their post on the mail coach to go to the next one. Now quite often they would write a little newsletter, just saying somebody's got married, the cows died, and whatever would happen locally. And that the next person would add. And so you began to get newsletters evolving. Newsletter was a very well-known way of getting information around and had been since the 1600s. But you began to get newsletters, and those newsletters, as they formalised, took on the names of the coaches. And so that's why you get the Bugle, the Clarion, those sort of Tantara sort of names that you get on some newspapers. So distribution, a key break on the speed of the development of the news. And this is the first paper that we would recognise as a modern newspaper. And it's called the Daily Universal Register. It was started by a bankrupt insurance broker called John Walter. And John Walter started it as the Daily Universal Register, and you can see that he's obviously put a bit of editorial on here because he's explaining why he started this new paper. But actually most of it is advertisements on the front cover, and until the 1966 was the last time that the Times had purely advertisements on the front page. I've got an example here actually which you might like to look at later. And 3 years later he changed the name to the Times newspaper, and they were based down near Blackfriars Station. So they weren't actually on Fleet Street, but their offices, their famous offices, were at Printing House Square, which had been the King's Printing House, and they were there until they moved to the Gray's Inn Road. So New Printing House Square is where we think of the Times being based. Basically, what you're beginning to get is the news as we recognise it, and it began to get illustrations. And one of the things that the Times did was use basically a steam-driven printing press. And when you got developments such as the cylinder, which was basically continuous printing, instead of having to clamp something down, it was rolling through. And then you got continuous paper at the end of the 1800s, and that really, really began to move things onto almost an industrial scale. Another break on the development of newspapers was stamp duty. And if you look at this here, the price is 6p, but that's divided into 2.5 pence for the cost of the paper, the printing and the labour, but 3.5 pence is for the stamp duty. And so this was really a major tax on the printed word. And in 1855 it was abolished. And that was when Colonel Arthur Slade decided to found the Daily Telegraph and Courier, as it was then called. And he basically got a lot of readers from the Morning Post, which was a very militarily aligned, fairly conservative readership. And they sort of kept that vibe going, really. Again, ads all over the front of it. So just to give you an idea of the papers that were going to be familiar with the names. And the Guardian, pretty early, but founded in Manchester as a non-conformist paper. The Standard, which is now no longer exists and is a free sheet called the London Standard, owned by Evgeny Lebedev. I've just put in Punch and the Illustrated London News because this was really the sort of famous 19th century periodicals, and which had really good black and white illustrations, and the Illustrated London News is just extraordinary in how fast they had illustrators called the black and white illustrators who would basically put illustrations together overnight, almost as quick as a photograph. Extraordinary. And they were trained by the same people to do sections of the same. They didn't do one illustration themselves. They would have a block that was divided up, a wood block in this case, divided up into 8 pieces, and each person would be drawing in the same style. Just extraordinary. And yeah. Anyway, and then all of these familiar. I mean, Daily Mail founded female. Get it? You know, in 1968, and because every woman needs her Daily Mail. Phenomenal. FT, originally completely finance focused, and has turned into an extraordinary. It's got extraordinary features section. Saturday FT. Rupert Bear, Daily Express. Daily Express was a massive seller, huge, and at its peak in about 1950, it was selling 2 million copies a day. Which, and the only one that was selling a bit more than that was the Daily Herald, which was finished by 1964. So 2 million was something that no papers can even dream of now. And then Rupert Bear, obviously incredibly famous, and first tabloid, the Daily Mirror, and then the last classic Fleet Street paper, ironically not on Fleet Street, was The Independent, that was founded by a group of journalists in 1986. And this is what a printing press looks like now. So this is now shared between News Corp, News UK, which is Rupert Murdoch's operation, and the Daily Mirror Group, which is something that would have been unheard of in the old days of Fleet Street. They would have killed each other rather than shared presses, but it just shows how they've had to consolidate because the print, and they're not just printing papers, they're printing everything, and they can print at the most extraordinary speed. So they've got 3 bases, one in Glasgow, one in Hertfordshire, and one on Merseyside. So just when I was approaching where we're sitting, and this is the Daily Telegraph building with behind it Peterborough Court, which is where the printing presses were. And I've got friends who used to work there, and who said that they used to sit in the cafe, and on the way to the cafe went past the printing presses, so you saw this incredible. And people used to walk in, you know, so relaxed back then, that when the printing presses started, usually about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I've got older journalist friends who now sort of in their 90s, and who tell you about the fear when your copy, if you were late with your copy and you heard the presses going, they said there was no better motivation than the sheer terror of a blank space, or being sacked. I was picking one or the other. Anyway, the detailing on the Telegraph building, it's been really difficult to see recently because of all the scaffolding, but it's really fabulous. And Fleet Street, like the City of London and finance, was all about speed. And so over the front door, you've got this wonderful, they're called the Mercuries. And it's two depictions, identical depictions, of the god Mercury with his wings on his hat, wings on his shoes, and he's dashing around the world to gather the news and bring it back to the centre of the universe, which is obviously Britain. Just on the facade of the building, these are rather different, maybe I can see them better here. But these little relief carvings are swifts. And swifts because of, obviously, the analogy with speed. And then there are two very creepy faces on the top here. This is past, and this is present. And they really, I find them nightmarish, but anyway. And then finally, you've got a clock. And clocks were all the way along Fleet Street because everybody was running to the clock. Time, talking of which, I'm just checking how I'm doing. Daily Express building, almost next door, but not quite. And it's interesting reading accounts at the time of when this was built, because the Telegraph building was built in the late 20s. You might have noticed, actually, I'll just nip back to see, do you see how Egyptian, particularly say the clock, there's Egyptian detailing, and that was because this was only about 6 years after Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, and everyone went mad for Egyptian-style libraries and everything. And the Daily Express was only built about 3 years later, but it shows a completely different look, which is basically American streamlined modern. And America the American economy overtook us in 1913. And so we were beginning to look to the States to see what they would do with their skyscrapers and the utility buildings and the great size of these company buildings that they had. So this is chromium, vitrolite and glass. And most people now absolutely love it. It has a sister building in Manchester, if anybody knows that. But at the time, people were quite dismayed by it, and private eyes always referred to it, once private eye came along, always referred to it as the Black Lubyanka after the president in Russia, despite the fact that politically they weren't anything like Russia. And then this is the Daily Mail, which moved south of Fleet Street, and a lot of printing presses, moved down to Tudor Street, the area that's sort of east of Inner Temple. And that was because the sheer scale of the printing presses. You could, it was some of the buildings on Fleet Street, unless you rebuilt, you couldn't manage it. So they moved down, and you had these. This is tiny compared to the ones they ended up with, but you can see the size of it, and you can see the metal plates that are curved to fit onto the cylinder. And there was always a little blank piece that could be taken out. And that was when you had some massive piece of news and you needed to stop the presses, so that's what stop press is, stop press, and they would slot in a little tiny story with just a headline and then start the presses again. It's very, very difficult to do, and so you didn't go stop press very often. It was a big deal. Reuters, Julius Reuter arrived in London with the telegraph office opening at the Royal Exchange in the city, and his empire expanded with the telegraph system. And so, the Daily Telegraph, like the old papers, took the name of the coach. Daily Telegraph took the name of the technology that was around at the time. So, very handsome building by Edwin Lutyens, and shared with the Press Association, which was domestic news, while Reuters was international news. So I just look at some institutions really, because this is St Bride's Church, and I'm sure many of you know this, or St Bride technically. And this was very badly bombed in the war, almost completely destroyed except for the tower. And it just shows you, like Notre Dame, be optimistic, because you can end up with a very beautiful replacement. We know this as the Journalist Church, but it's only been known as that since the late 1980s, early 1990s, and that's because of the kidnap of a young journalist called John McCarthy. He's now broadcasting, you might have heard him if you listen to Radio 4. And John McCarthy was not working for a Fleet Street paper, or a particularly famous paper, but he was kidnapped in Lebanon by Hezbollah and kept for 5 years. And his girlfriend, Jill Morell, on the left, was also in journalism, and she thought the only way to keep his name top of mind was to have a weekly vigil every Friday night in St Bride's. And they had this vigil, and that corner of St Bride's is now called the Journalists' Memorial Chapel, and there's a talk every year. And one of the people that did that talk about 13 years ago was a lady with the eye patch. She got killed. Little cut, sorry, it'll come to me in a minute. And she's super famous, so I should remember. Anyway, so she exactly. St Bride Foundation. This is a wonderful. If you don't know it, absolutely go, because it was started as a St Bride Institute, bearing in mind that most printers were not wealthy. Most printers were living near Fleet Street, and they often didn't have bathing facilities at home. They didn't have bathrooms, and so this was partly a welfare centre, really, because they had slipper baths in here that you could come in and use, and a slipper bath being a standalone bathtub, and you could do rudimentary washing, and there was a swimming pool, which weirdly, the swimming pool changing rooms were designed by Charles Dickens and his great mate at that time, Angela Burdett Coutts, who was the richest woman in London. It's sort of so random, I haven't found out the story behind that anyway. And basically it was also, they had printing presses there, because by this time printing was really dangerous. If you were an apprentice and you made a mistake, you could lose an arm. And so they basically were training the sons and apprentices of printers so that they would be safe when they did eventually turn up on the newspaper floor. And then Elvino, a real Fleet Street institution, and please, if you don't go, because it's tough these days. They had such huge newspaper staffs in the past, and they need all the help they can get. And when you go, just raise a glass for John Mortimer, who did a famous fight for freedom of the press in the Oz trials in the 1960s. And I know I haven't got time, but just really briefly, one of the reasons that the Oz trial happened was that the group of people who published Oz, including people like Germaine Greer, published an issue that had Rupert Bear on the front in a state of arousal, I think we'll say. And that was enough to basically, that tip the edge, and it was John Mortimer that defended them. John Mortimer's great hero was Rumpole of the Bailey, the great criminal lawyer who was always skinned and basically was under lots of stress. And he would meet lots of lawyers and crims in here, and his favourite tipple was Chateau Thames Embankment, which was the cheapest that you could get. And then Private Eye, never been on Fleet Street, and that's probably indicative, because they've always, they worked out of various members of the staff's mother's flats for about 40 years. And they're now in Soho, have been for quite a long time, under the editorship of Ian Hislop, who's been editor for, I should say, close on 40 years. And this is where the Street of Shame comes from, because it's a regular column. And it seems so appropriate. They keep, they keep hold the establishment's nose to the grindstone, but also the Fleet Street as well, the newspapers as well. And this brings me to the end of Fleet Street, and this is either the devil incarnate or a great publisher, whichever way you see it. I'm getting a bit worried about time. Is everybody relaxed? Or is and Rupert Murdoch, to give him his due, Australian born, as you probably all know, but his father was a newspaperman. His father has a plaque in St Bride's Church on one of the pews. And Keith Murdoch was a real passionate about newspapers, and he passed that on to his son, because if Rupert Murdoch didn't love papers, he would just be doing, the money comes from his TV and his other enterprises, He had 4 newspapers, and he bought The Sun in the 1960s. And one of the things that he was intent on doing was basically breaking the power of the unions here. And the reason was the print unions. Now, everyone forgets that actually Today newspaper, which was for about a year and a half, was printed by Eddie Shah, who was he had 6 newspapers in Manchester. And it was Eddie Shah who first took on the unions, actually, everybody forgets this. In about 1983, Eddie Shah, one of his papers was called the Warrington Messenger. And he had 6 printers on it who wouldn't join the union, and the union demanded that he sack them, he refused. And basically there was a major confrontation. And to give you an idea of how angry it got, there were 3 coffins, little coffins, left outside his house, so I'm aware there's a person here, for his children. And it was that vicious. So when we think now of how angry people get about things, you have to remember it was really quite violent in the 70s and 80s. Anyway, he only had Today for about a year, but it was quite radical. It was offset litho, not hot metal, and it had colour. Woo, exciting for the time. Anyway, here's the Sun, Murdoch's first purchase was edited by Larry Lamb. If anybody gets a chance to see the play Ink, I don't know if anyone saw that, but it was really excellent about Jamie Graham play on this period. This is what happened when Rupert Murdoch, it was always said that there'd been a secret lunch with Margaret Thatcher, and it's been denied until about 2 years ago. And there was a secret lunch with Margaret Thatcher, and they basically, because politically she was behind him for breaking the unions. And his argument was that his papers in America and Australia were being printed on offset litho, and he could do those with 5 printers per edition. And he said, in London, I have 18 people per edition using a system that's been working since the 1400s. And obviously, if you get a union person, you will get different, those are the two opposing point of views. But his point of view as a businessman was, why should I pay 18 people who all have other jobs, including firemen, morticians, all sorts of things? They really controlled what went on in Fleet Street, so depending on your politics, you either agreed with Murdoch or you agreed with the print unions. But certainly it was the beginning of the end for Fleet Street as we knew it, because eventually he basically had set up an entire printing press in Wapping, in Tobacco Dock in Wapping, in one of the old warehouses there, and it was ready to go, and it was staffed by the members of a rogue union. And he basically issued an ultimatum to his own printers on Fleet Street, and they said, near Fleet Street, and when they refused, he fired the entire lot, and any journalists that wouldn't support him as well were fired at the same time. So there were 6,000 staff, 5,000 of them were, I can't have been 5,000 out of the job, but anyway, thousands of people were fired, and you got this genuine fighting. The people who kept going into work were still, when I was, I was never on staff at any of the papers, but I used to go in, everybody knew who the scabs were from that time. They all knew the people who had gone into work when other people were striking. It was very violent, and it went on for quite a long time. And then finally, probably a low point in journalistic history, which was the Leveson inquiry just down the road at the Royal Courts of Justice. And this was looking at particularly phone hacking, but generally the ethics of the British press. This was part 1. Part 2 has never happened. And so when Keir Starmer came to power, that was something that he was asked about, and it doesn't look as if it's going to happen anymore. The appetite seems to have gone. So Rebecca Wade, who was very famously editor of The Sun, of the News of the World, basically was it had a long trial and was eventually found not guilty, and she's now back in News Corp working for Rupert Murdoch in a very senior capacity. The real story is circulations, and I think I mentioned earlier that the Daily Express at its peak was selling 2 million copies a day. The News of the World, which came to an end in 2011 after the Leveson inquiry, was a Sunday newspaper only, but that was selling at its peak 8.4 million copies a day. And this feeds so much into the issues that we've got at the moment. There's no point going through the numbers, you can see what's happened, and these are not recent, these are from 2010. And the reason I haven't put in more recent ones is that the audited figures from ABC, they now allow publications not to give accurate circulations, which probably tells you everything. And it's gone down massively from last year, let alone in the 2020. So are we ever going to read all about it like this? Are we going to continue to do so? And my feeling is that I think some of the big titles are going to, the ones that have a really distinctive personality, I've always thought they would survive. I have no idea what's going to happen now AI is on the cards. And so there's no coincidence that Fleet Street has completely changed. So the Murdoch move to Wapping precipitated everybody leaving Fleet Street and moving to the newer printing technologies. The Telegraph went to Victoria, the Guardian was on the Farringdon Road anyway, Times was at New Printing House Square, and the Telegraph and the Mirror were originally both in Canary Wharf, and Mirror's still there. So this, to me, that explosion outwards, the distribution of titles, it very much echoes what's happening with information in general. Because in the time since this world existed, you've got now, what do we have? We had about 20 daily titles, probably of different sizes, and we had 5 TV channels. And now you've got infinite of everything in all directions. And so you don't have 8 million people sharing the same experience of reading a paper and sharing those politics or whatever. It's completely changed. So very briefly, we've mentioned the Fleet Street Quarter, and actually just quickly, this building here housed D&C Thompson. I'm sure some of you know that because they published the Beano, and they were here. The building the office is still here, but nothing being published there. And basically, this is what the Fleet Street, the Daily Telegraph building looks like now. It's been stunningly refurbished with Qatari money. And what you've got now is it's got an extra. They've done it very discreetly. When you're outside the Telegraph, you can't see that what they've done to it. So it's really beautifully done. They didn't take out the basement. They've basically done a very sustainable removal of gas, diesel, all the old plumbing, all the old everything. And somehow they managed to do it without doing too much destruction and without doing a huge building site to remove the basement underneath. They've managed to use what was there. So this is the new things that you need to do when you're developing a building. But on top, it's going to have a restaurant. The middle of it's going to be office space. The top is going to have the inevitable rooftop restaurant, which we now have everywhere now. The ground floor will also have restaurants. And behind it is this. So here's the building, and you can see the roof on top. And here's the what was called River Court, which was a building right behind the Telegraph building. Sorry, what am I talking about? River Court's this one behind the Express. But this is where the printers were, the Peterborough Court was behind, and basically that is a massive office building. So it's almost as if they're sort of being cuddled by the buildings behind them, and you can see that it's connected by a terrace, which would be, I think that's going to be open to the public. And next door, here you've got, basically, here's the teeny little Express building, and that's been wrapped around by the building that was called River Court, which is again now wrapped around it. And what's exciting about that is that that's been beautifully restored as well. But what we're going, as members of the public, for the first time, this has been Goldman Sachs. Both these newspaper offices have been Goldman Sachs since the papers moved out in the 80s. And basically what we're now going to have is access to this building. And we, with luck, will be able to see the incredible lobby completely over the top, which was designed when the building opened. I mean, sort of like, a metropolis styling from the 30s, and there's a great little newspaper boy here. Salisbury Square, just over the road, the new development underway at the moment, and they've just revealed the facade. So if you walk out onto Fleet Street after this, have a look, because they've slightly jettied the front of the building. There's a concrete front and it's got jetting, which I think may be a nice little reference to those old newspaper buildings that I showed you at the beginning. Eric Parry building, but sorry, and I forgot to say what it is, which is that it's going to have 18 courts, tribunals and law courts, and it's also going to have the headquarters of the City of London Police. And so this is now beginning, Fleet Street is now beginning to be called the Justice Quarter. So the good thing about that is that it's going to be working, there's going to be masses of working people around. There are going to be lawyers and police, coming and going. And that means that with any luck, Elvina will keep going.
Anyway, to Dr. Johnson's house.
And Dr. Johnson's house, exactly. And so I'll end here. I have run over a bit. Have you got 2 minutes just to listen to a description of a Fleet Street lunch?
Yes.
This is by a guy called Robin Esser. I don't know if anyone has heard of him. He was the editor of the Daily Express. And I read this to some American journalism students, and I forgot to tell them that it was the 1970s. And they were absolutely appalled. Beyond appalled. They were like, I might get cancelled or something. And I said, because obviously we don't do that now, it's the 1970s. They went, oh, thank God for that. Anyway, here we go. I would occasionally be summoned to lunch with Derek, who was Derek Marks, who was the editor for in the late 60s. From the office, we would go to Alvino, the popular watering hole in E4. There we would consume a bottle of champagne each. Then on to the Boulistan, the restaurant then in Covent Garden, where we'd sit at the bar, choosing our food while sipping a Paris goblet of dry sherry, which they kept in the fridge for the editor. At the table, two of us would have a bottle of Chablis with our first course, on to 1 or 2 bottles of claret with our main course, finishing up with a couple of cognacs and coffee. We'd then climb into the editor's chauffeur-driven car for the short journey back to Fleet Street. But we'd roll by the Express building, stopping at Poppins, which was literally the pub that was sort of underneath the east side of the Express building, the staff's favoured watering hole at the end of Poppins Court. There Derek would rap on the window of the by now closed pub, and the landlord would open up for us, and over several glasses of port, he and Derek would discuss which horses to back in the later races that afternoon. After that, we would stagger back to the office, Derek to drink beef tea, and me to ask my deputy to take over and order a taxi to take me home to a bar and a well-earned rest. And Derek would work all afternoon until the paper went to bed. Well, we haven't got much time. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I was going to say the
Come
same.
up afterwards if you probably need to
No, we're okay for time. If I want to throw the floor open, either privately or to the floor.
And before you go, you might want to have a look at these, because when I was 40, which is an alarmingly long time ago, somebody gave me a present, which is the facsimiles of the Times. This is from 1962. And because my birth was in the one about 3 days later, but my best mate's birth is in here. So it's not good. But anyway, can you see the whole thing? No pictures, obviously no colour, and purely advertisements. And when you look at them, this is one from the century before, which came in the same thing.
It's the same.
And basically, it's all. If anybody's seen a brown and white fox terrier in the vicinity of the Albemarle Club, could they please leave me a note here? It's just like a different world. Anyway, if anyone's interested, you see this looks like rock and roll in comparison. But anyway, if anyone's interested in looking at these, I'll tell you what, I'll put them on here.
Not that one, if you don't mind. Sorry, behind you. There's perfect.
I'll put them on there.
Sorry, that's a pleasure, but I'm a bit precious about that. Well, I think that was extraordinary. I've learned an enormous amount, and I thought I'd been around 15 years, Fleet Street, as a resident and as a worker. And there's so much I've learned from your talk, so thank you. That was absolutely brilliant.
And that, by the way, is one of the prints. You can see there's a reflection on it because I nicked it. I photographed it in Elvino. They've got a really good collection of, I didn't think they'd mind, they've got a really good collection of prints. And the alcohol thing, people are very, very disapproving. It's such a generational difference.